You're listening to Accounted For, the Canadian podcast that explores the intangibles of every career. I'm your host, Daniel Lee. Hey folks, happy Wednesday. I'm back in your ears again with a really cool interview. I had the great chance to interview Conrad McGee-Stocks, who is the growth lead at Uken Games. I was introduced to Conrad through a friend of mine, John, if you're listening, thank you. And I asked my friend John, who in your network has the most interesting career, and he recommended Conrad, so thanks, John. Conrad started out in business, and he left halfway through to attend the Ontario College of Arts and Design, commonly known as OCAD in the Ontario sphere. And he wanted to do that to go deeper into the world of advertising with more of a design mindset. And so he did this halfway through, and we go through the decision-making process that went in for that. And in our chat, we also go through the various responsibilities of what someone in growth marketing would actually do, because I personally wasn't too familiar with it, and I came out of the interview with a great overview of what actually goes on and what you have to do in a growing tech company and how your responsibilities will actually evolve as the company grows. And Uken is a mobile gaming company, and I also wanted to really drive into what the gaming industry was also like, and a little bit also about how Conrad might actually utilize the habit-forming principles that you would put into game design into his own life, because from my conversation with John, I learned that Conrad also did think a lot about habits and a lot of development in his own personal life as well. And so this was a really cool chat, and we go through the various areas of growth marketing, habits, and a lot more. So I really hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, here's the interview. Hey everyone, welcome back to Accounted For. Today on the podcast, I have with me Conrad McGee-Stocks. Hi Conrad, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey man, how's it going?
Good. So Conrad is the growth lead at Uken Games here in downtown Toronto. And so just to start off with, Conrad, can you explain to the audience who may not be familiar with Uken Games what the company does and what it might be known for?
Sure. So we're a mobile game studio. That means we make games for Android and iOS. And this studio's been around for 8 or 9 years now. It's founded by two guys, Chris Yee and Mark Lampert. And together they built a studio. Now we're about a little over 100 people. We're down at King and Duncan, and we've been around for a while now. Still really feels like a small startup. I joined employee number 40-ish, so I've sort of seen the company grow and mature. You might not call us a startup anymore, maybe more of a scale-up. I think that's probably a more popular term now these days. But so we make games. Our biggest games right now, so we work with Sony on some titles. So we have a game called Jeopardy World Tour with Alex Trebek, and then we're just getting ready to launch another game, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And these are both coming out simultaneously. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is going to come out actually next week, so we're pretty busy kind of getting ready for that. And then other games that we do, a game called Bingo Pop is a really popular title. And then the other thing that we're really active in is the AR space, and we've got a title called Kings of Pool. So you can play basically virtual pool anywhere with a friend. So that's really what we're focused on right now, and then we're always looking at other stuff.
Okay, great. No, thanks for the big overview. And so for the audience members, we are recording this September 18th, 2018, and so the new games will probably have been released by the time you're hearing this, so definitely go check it out and take the time to enjoy it. So I guess I wanted to start the big interview going back to the beginnings of the beginnings part of your childhood. Like, where did you grow up? How would you describe your childhood?
Sure. Oh, okay, going way back.
Yeah.
So I guess I grew up really in like a small town, Paris, Ontario. But I went to school in Hamilton. And it was I had like a spectacular childhood as far as childhoods go. Like really supportive parents. Hey, do whatever you want. The school that I went to was sort of fairly monodimensional in the sense that, or maybe not mono, but fairly narrow in the sense that you either went into business, or you went into law, or you went into science. If you're interested in sciences, when you went and became a doctor, it was sort of like very limited. So I think high school was maybe sort of fairly academic. I wasn't necessarily the most academic person, but it was a pretty academic school. That's, I guess, maybe how I would characterize my childhood from a really high level. I played a lot of video games too.
Okay, which is a bit of a connection with the video games and where you are now.
Yeah, kind of, I guess.
Yeah, but you didn't want to be like a professional gamer or something when you were like 7 years old? That wasn't a dream?
I feel like that wasn't even a thing when I was 7. Like I think that like the whole, like eSports, streaming, all of that stuff is like relatively recent. And I think that when I was a kid, it was still like gaming and that whole kind of space hadn't really come into its own. It was still kind of seen as like this small offshoot of entertainment. Like now or relatively recently, I think if you look at the numbers, like more people watched eSports last year than the MLB. Not that I have anything against Major League Baseball. It's just that's pretty crazy that like, hey, here's this huge thing, and all of a sudden, like video games are more watched. And I think that if you look back at the 90s, early 2000s, it wasn't necessarily the same thing. So had that been on the radar, I think I probably would have been like, oh, this is awesome. Definitely I want to be a streamer, but that wasn't really a thing back then.
Yeah. I think for me, so my background is I'm South Korean, and so people in the gaming world know that South Koreans are very big into games. And when I was young, growing up, my uncle, he actually played StarCraft semi-professionally. So
okay. Yeah, I was gonna say craft. Like
so I actually had an uncle who sat me down and taught me StarCraft when I was 5-6 years old, and I'm just learning to play a game. And I actually grew up just watching people just play online games, and I guess like eSports now they call it, back when I was growing up in Korea and like the nearby area. But yeah.
So I think you have like like LAN culture, like LAN places, things like that. Yeah, I think that's like a lot bigger, a lot bigger in South Korea than it was here.
But no, it's weird how it's kind of shifting, and there's a part of me that actually likes watching esports, because I think that's the only time when announcers refer to competitors as Korea versus the world a lot of times. So there's a bit of that national pride sometimes coming up, and we're not really good at a lot of things, so that's nice to see. But yeah, so a mutual, I guess, friend or colleague of yours, John, introduced us together, and this kind of came about when I asked John, a friend of mine, hey, who do you know in your circle who has a really interesting and fascinating career? And he's like, oh yeah, my boss, Conrad, definitely. And yeah, like you mentioned how your high school, you either go to business or medicine, and based on your LinkedIn profile, when I look at it, you went to business, you went to Dalhousie, then you went to OCAD and kind of like a designer route, and now you are in, I think you did like a bit of like operations at fashion or like a fashion apparel company, and now you're in mobile games. So can you take me back to the beginning? Like, okay, you did business, we understand that path, and then what was the switch? Like, what happened from there?
Yeah, so I started in business, and it wasn't super fulfilling in the sense that, I think that a business degree is really great if you want to go, if you're interested in working in finance, or if you're interested in working in accounting, something semi-traditional, for people who are maybe more entrepreneurially inclined, or if they're not necessarily sure, what area. I don't know if it's a spectacular path, or it wasn't for me. So that's why I was kind of interested in design, communication, that kind of thing. Really, the way I kind of think about it is just like in conversion in general, and converting people to stuff. The main way you do that is through advertising, and that was an area that was like always very interested to me. And I'm trying to remember when I sort of was like, oh, this seems like something like actually worth studying. And however I sort of got interested in it, at the time I had been running like an event promotion company with a couple friends, and sort of routing shows, doing bookings in Halifax. It was fairly easy to throw decent parties and get people who at the time, this is back like 2010, 2011, it's probably easier to get pretty good bookings. Like I feel like music has kind of been, not that it wasn't then, but there was like you had access to really great talent, and you could put pretty good shows together in like a 300 to 600 person room. That now might be maybe more difficult to book. I don't know. I've been out of the space for a long time.
Sorry, so is this during university? You're actually running this with friends?
Yes, this is during university. And sort of basically throwing parties effectively, like parties in university. So like Halifax, right? So it's kind of doing that. And they also was doing some of their clothing stuff. Not actually what's on my LinkedIn, but more or less I had enough work and had been kind of doing some advertising, and I put that together in like a little portfolio and pitched it to OCAD and said, hey, like I'm moving back from Nova Scotia, blah blah blah, kind of have advanced standing, please. And long story short, they said, okay, yeah, sure, you've got enough work. And I finished my degree in advertising there, which is actually a degree in design, which is kind of a contrast to a lot of the work that I do now, which is not necessarily design related. Like I still work really closely with the creative team here and on my team, but in terms of like execution or really formal feedback, I don't do a whole lot of that anymore. But that's sort of how it started.
Okay, and what made you want to switch out in the midst of Dalhousie and go into OCAD specifically in like the design realm and advertising realm rather, instead of doing like marketing at a business program?
That's super interesting. Maybe part of it was it seemed like there wasn't, I don't know, like I was sort of just looking at like the program itself, what it was teaching, and none of it felt super, it just didn't feel necessarily all that relevant. If you looked at the marketing program, so like if I looked at some of the other more formal disciplines, it was like, oh, that was a good program, but the marketing one, I was like, I wasn't sure that it was necessarily like worth it, I guess, in the long run. I was kind of like, I wasn't sort of sold on it. And I thought that maybe a more sort of formal design education, which is effectively complementary to, or advertising being complementary to marketing, I thought that might be maybe more difficult to learn after the fact. Like it kind of felt like the marketing program, there's a lot of stuff that you could pick up that you didn't necessarily need to go to school for, versus like a design education where there was like a lot of things that you weren't just going to pick that up. And so I kind of sort of chose to pursue that, and that's kind of really why I made the switch. But I had sort of always been interested in that path, and that was always something that I always had thought about. So it was like I kind of always had like three main things I really liked. One was computer science, the other was design, and then the third was just sort of business, I guess, in general, as sort of like a bucket. So I chose to kind of switch from one to the other, and then I've always sort of been sort of nurturing a love for, I guess, like tech, computer science, that kind of thing. Sort of that's always sort of been in the background, and then only more recently, maybe in the last 4 years, has that sort of become more central to my role and to what I'm doing and to my day-to-day.
Oh, okay. And did you have any chance to do computer science stuff while you were in school, or like as soon as you graduated? Did you try to explore that? Like, I know you're into that data stuff because we talked about all the data podcasts you listen to. But yeah, where did you start mixing in that computer science stuff?
I mean, it was sort of a lot of it started with like buying ads on Facebook. Yeah, so that's kind of how like you get the performance marketing thing. It's like, if I look at like maybe the last 6 to 8 years, one thing that kind of runs through like all of them is I've been buying ads on Facebook for a really long time now. And so initially it's like, okay, you're trying to buy ads to promote a party or sell tickets. Then it's, buying ads to sell basically luxury loungewear, and then more recently, over the last 4 years, it's generating installs, growing the games. And so, I've really seen that platform mature over the past number of years. But I think that's maybe where the initial sort of love of data started. And that's where I think everything really, I guess, began. Yeah, would be in that data, and then I've always sort of been building websites or been something, like, not that that's super technical, but prior I sort of studied. Even did some comp sci in university and decided not to necessarily pursue it full time as an engineer, but it was still sort of always interested in it and what was happening.
Oh, okay. And so, then let's say now we're at the path where you've graduated from OCAD, you have this design training now. Were you running your events company whilst doing OCAD as well?
No, so OCAD, while I was at OCAD, I kind of had wrapped up on that. There was a couple other guys that were involved in business, and they were more or less focused on it. I had kind of exited from that. And while I was wrapping up at OCAD, I was actually helping launch a clothing company with a number of friends. The guy who founded it was Adam Bleeden, who I still sort of consider a close friend. And it's called Lazy Pants. And his whole insight was, why are these things called sweatpants? When all you want to do is be lazy in them. So the whole genesis of that was like, why sweat when you can be lazy? So he kind of was on to something there, and had gotten like a lot of great traction with some places. So in the U.S., key retailers were Kitson, and then here the Bay carried us, Sporting Life, TNT. So it was more like high end. Holtz carried us too, and I did that for a while, and then eventually, as I was wrapping up school, I kind of realized like, okay, it was really great. The team was like 6 of us, I think at the time. It was pretty small, but it sort of really seen revenue grow, and it was really fun. But I really wanted to sort of pursue something that was maybe more in line with core interests and something that I kind of wanted to pursue long term. Clothing was interesting, apparel was interesting, but I necessarily don't have the highest affinity to women's sweatpants. It's like I compare like a video games, women's sweatpants. Not that really when I left I was like, oh, I want to go work in games. That was like definitely never on the radar for me. When I was sort of wrapping up, I thought I was going to go and probably go agency side and work at a traditional agency as like an art director or something, or maybe in strategy. I sort of hadn't really nailed that thing out, but that's kind of where I was leaning towards. And then it was really sort of like a chance encounter with friends, got talking to some people, found out about Uken, met Chris and Mark, and somebody previously who was in the growth team at the studio was much smaller back then, but somebody who I still consider as a mentor, Peter Sung. He more or less hired me here, and I was working with him for a while. He left to sort of go pursue healthcare, like a healthcare startup, and that's kind of where sort of things kind of got rolling here, and I sort of took over the team and grew from there to where we are now. And yeah, it was sort of, I guess that was that kind of, when didn't start out as a planned long-term thing. I was still sort of, for a while, thinking I was going to go into advertising, but that sort of never materialized. The culture here was amazing. Yeah, I really loved it and sort of fell in love with it.
And you mentioned about how what you do now, it doesn't really utilize much of that advertising that you studied back at OCAD, and more of the design principles there. But from someone outside looking in who's not very familiar with, let's say, advertising and marketing, mm-hmm. They seem very similar, advertising and marketing. So where's the contrast?
Sure, I can see how there's a fairly nuanced difference between the two. So here, the main focus, performance marketing. So when you say performance marketing, especially in the mobile space, you're talking about, spending deploying a lot of capital, and you have a lot of models that are built out around understanding your return over a period of time, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, a year. Especially in games, you really understand, like, for every dollar you spend, who you acquired, how many people, how often they like to play, things like that. So there's a ton of, it's a really data-rich environment. So you really understand, you have a really strong understanding of the types of things that you're doing with those marketing dollars that you're spending. So it's sort of maybe more similar to finance in that sense. So there's a lot of sort of control over that, and you really have a lot of levers to drive growth in that space. Whereas maybe when I would have studied at OCAD, more traditional advertising, you're talking about more traditional brand advertising where you're buying on channels, not just like on the internet, not totally performance. So you can't attribute all of the ROI directly. So you're looking at buying on TV, buying on all these other channels, and sure, you can do incremental lift studies, things like that, and obviously lots of brands do that, and and that also happens at like a totally different scale. Buying nationwide TV campaigns in the US and Canada, that's definitely slightly different. So I guess it's less directly attributable, and I think that's probably the main thing. If you compare the two, is that like the difference of direct attribution and really just the different business model for agencies. They're working with clients, helping sort of translate and sell and build stories. There's still a lot of storytelling in what we do, obviously. That's one of the things that I love, but it's for us as opposed to other people.
Okay, and yeah, I guess with that advertising side, I guess that's some of my friends have been calling it closer to, I guess, more traditional marketing, the old school system. And so then if we were to look at, I guess, what you do, I guess more close to new school, the growth marketing space, and like how would you break that up? Like I see people who do like they're called user acquisition, and some people call it growth marketers, and some people are just straight just growth only. How does that actually break down in terms of an entire kind of ecosystem?
Sure. I think it depends on where they are and what they're doing. I think really, in my mind, they're kind of all synonyms.
Yeah.
I think, if someone does UA, your user acquisition, I think that's, if someone told me, oh, I do UA, I'd say, chances are it's probably in games, just because that's like a pretty familiar vernacular for people that work in that space. I think that's pretty common. Or something where you have, players, users, players, users synonym there. And I think that's kind of one area where you get pretty used to hearing that term. Growth marketing, or growth marketer, that's kind of what we say here. I think that's a reflection of, the team is built up of people who don't just do user acquisition. Maybe you're thinking about retention or re-engagement. Those two things are focuses of like how you have people enjoy the apps, for a longer period of time than just, a shorter period of time. Whereas, maybe someone who's just doing UA is like laser focused on how do I get the most number of people to play this game for the cheapest price, which isn't a bad maxim, but there's, I think there's more focused depending on what the other things you are doing. So I think that's kind of a reflection of the growth marketer title. There's things you have to think about on the organic side, like app store optimization. So that's something that, the team also focuses on and thinks about, okay, like how do we, and you can take a conversion lens to that too and say, okay, well, what's the most compelling narrative, or what's the most compelling, what feature should I be talking about? What should we really be effectively selling, or trying to show potential players on the App Store to make the marketing or the acquisition the most effective? And having the same person think about both of those things has advantages in my experience.
Mm-hmm. And with those marketers, then, do you segregate out who does things like paid marketing versus people that do like search engine optimization? How does that work out?
So so one for us, it would be App Store optimization rather than search engine.
Oh yeah.
Given that the main engine, not to say that search engine isn't important for driving growth for games, but I think like that sort of falls like maybe second tier in my mind. To like the App Store optimization first, SEM second, because depending on like the type of game. So maybe you have other games that have like maybe mid-core. There's maybe more long tail in certain spaces, maybe less in casual, depending on. But I think that's totally up for debate. But no, it's sort of like really under the same person's purview. It's like, hey, really it's about driving growth. It's like, hey, how do you drive the most growth possible? And a lot of time, you're thinking about either how do you make the assets, the games, the products that you're trying to grow the most compelling for people. And then the second order thing is, okay, well, how do you get the most eyeballs then on that product or thing that you're trying to grow. So that's why, in my mind, it makes sense to have the same person think about both of those things, because they seem very sort of adjacent to one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so if we dive a little deeper into, I guess, what you do, so I guess taking more of a picture of looking at yourself as a business that has different operating segments where you would invest your time into different activities. How would you slot these activities into whichever buckets that apply? And you decide, like, assign, say, like a percentage of time to it. So as like an example, when I was at the hedge fund, my time would be allocated to, let's say, about 50% research, focus on actually reading reports, and let's say 30% on talking to management of companies, and then 20% or roughly actually discussing with the team and team meetings and more administrative stuff.
Okay, so there's a ton of different things. I wish I could say 30% sounds like a big time chunk to me.
Right. You could make it even more minute, detailed if you want.
Yeah. So I think that I think there still are big pieces of my time that are spent. So a lot of it is on planning and thinking about it from a strategic standpoint. Like, okay, where should we be investing time? Where do we get a competitive edge? Marketing or UA in the game space is, I think, notoriously pretty competitive. So there's a lot. You're competing with a lot of really smart people out there, both pretty much globally, because there's not a whole lot of barriers, minus a couple sort of specific markets. But a lot of the time you're competing globally. So you can find competitive advantages in a number of different places, whether it's the creative, how you're operating, the way you do your A/B testing, the way you collect data, things like that. And collecting data just in the sense of not getting player data so much or personal information, but more just as from an engagement perspective, what do people like, what do people not like, how do you delight them with more experiences that they like and do less of what they don't like, and give them an experience that they're willing to pay for, because I think that's ultimately what free-to-play is about when it's done well, when it's balanced, and it can create a really enjoyable experience. I think that's one of the things we're always trying to do. So kind of bringing it back to the what do I spend my time on? I spend my time on planning, so I call it 30% planning, 30% data roadmap stuff, or just sort of data in general. I can sort of blow that out or speak more specifically about that. Really, actually, I could say that I spend 90% of my time planning and thinking about the future, and then a smaller percentage of my time helping execute, and that's sort of a reflection of a really strong team. So a lot of my time, I would say, is more spent planning, and then a smaller portion is spent on making sure that things are working. So maybe there'll be a data fire, maybe there'll be some issues, and I'm pretty executional by nature, so I do love to sort of get my hands dirty, jump in, whether it's a lot of our processes are driven we're a big AWS customer, so we have there's a lot of really great cloud stuff. So jumping in and so trying to assess an issue, but for the most part, I think these days I'm sort of thinking about the future, thinking about how to plan, thinking about what makes the most sense from an executional standpoint, whether it's on the UA front or on the forecasting, or how we understand and make our acquisition more competitive. And in the UA space, you can do that in a number of different ways.
And so in that planning part, if we were to dig deeper there, is there a specific activity that you find the most enjoyable out of all the other ones that just immediately puts you into flow state and you're just zoned in? This is what I love doing.
Yeah, I think that looking at I feel there's a lot of stuff that puts me into a flow state, because I really enjoy what I do. So it's you instantly say that, I'm oh, but there's this. I'm trying to think of what the kind of main thing within the planning bucket that's really exciting. But I think that the leverage that you get from identifying the right opportunity to derive a competitive advantage, and being circumspect about that and saying like, okay, well, we have X number of hours to invest in something. We can either choose to do X, Y, or Z. I think there's like a ton of joy when you pick the right one. It's sort of like the satisfaction of like, oh, it worked. And so when you're right, so I guess it's sort of an addiction to, not guessing, but planning effectively. So really it's like that effective planning of saying like, okay, I think we should try to build out this feature for our dashboards so that we can look at our acquisition in a specific way, or we can slice things this way, or maybe we should try to model the data in this way to uncover this insight. And so I'm kind of being vague, but it's sort of nebulous, without getting like super specific. But that kind of exercise and saying like, okay, we planned it this way, let's try it. Trying it, and then the great thing about the performance marketing, especially in the game space, is you like understand really quickly how your decisions have impacted the returns that you're able to generate as a growth team. So you make a successful sort of call, whether it's on the type of creative that you're using, maybe it's the message, or maybe it's even just the way that other people are trying to understand if they're making the right decisions. That for me is like spectacular. I love that.
And so that it seems that that's kind of closer to how you would even measure your own performance in terms of how well you're doing as an individual as well as like a team.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think about the way like I'd measure my ability to, I guess, get the most out of the team's output. That's kind of the way that I sort of think about myself. Is like, okay, I think anybody, like I'm a huge believer in servant leadership. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
Yeah.
If you've ever heard that term, but yeah, like a huge believer in servant leadership. So I always think about like, okay, well, like how do I, apply the most leverage to get the most time? So if I can put in 1 hour, and get 10 out from the people that work with me, then that's huge. So it's like, how do I optimize my hour to make their 10 hours like the most effective? And so it's that leverage point that I think is super powerful. There's a really awesome book. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ray Dalio.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ray talks about that
in his book Principles.
Yeah, in his book Principles. And that I think that concept is spectacular, and I think that is really the way I started sort of framing things and looking at it, and what makes me tick in that sense. Yeah.
And so then if we decide to go into actually the details of what you do. So if we were to take a day like today,
sure.
So we started the interview today at 2:00.
What did I do prior?
Yeah, what did you do prior to 2, and what are your activities slotted to do after?
That's a great question. I'm like actually pulling up my calendar just so I can make sure I'm completely honest with what I say.
Yeah.
So actually this is interesting. Tuesday's a cool day. When I come in at around 8, I always have 30 minutes blocked out to evaluate blockers. So I just sit down and I basically try to list out like, okay, what are all the blockers to success, whether it's personal or for the team or the company, like at whatever sort of scale, and say, okay, well, what is it that's like holding us back? What's stopping success? And I found that it's like a sort of like a Tuesday ritual for me. I think Monday's no good. Monday's too busy for that. Tuesday's a great day, and you just sit down and you just kind of like write out like, okay, what are the issues? So I do that every Tuesday. And then, sort of 30 minutes to review some material. Like I said, we work with Sony a lot, so sometimes there's always back and forth. There's always great opportunities because they obviously have a ton of press connections. So, there's some work there. Anytime you're doing IP licensing work, there's things you have to look at. And so it's one of my responsibilities to really just say like, okay, that makes sense. What else have I done today? So we just hired 2 more people for the team, 2 more growth marketers. So with that comes a lot of onboarding, and I'm a huge fan of always improving the onboarding process. So just sort of looking at like, okay, from so John was really my first hire actually. John's onboarding was probably pretty crappy relative to, like the 14th person that's joined the team, right? So having that difference, and the way you generate that distance is like a really tight feedback loop of saying like, okay, what was good, what didn't make sense, and making sure that making sure that people really document like what's not working or what they didn't get. I think the growth space, acquisition space, is notorious for a lot of really obscure like acronyms. There's a lot of obscurity, and there's not, because it's a fairly new space. There's like not a ton of great writing about it. You know, there's a really great blog run by a guy named Eric, Mobile Dev Memo. That's one thing that I think is like anybody that wants to work in the mobile space and anyone that's interested in acquisition is like read that. You know, there's a ton of like great insight there. Yeah, really kind of, you know, maybe there's like one other, especially for games, Deconstructor of Fun. Like those are other guys that are really quite smart and putting out really good content. But otherwise, there's like maybe fairly, it's just like maybe ad vendors. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's like, you know, people who have blogs and it's content marketing. So I think might be difficult for somebody coming into the space to really differentiate between content marketing, which everything is at some point content marketing, but you know, there's varying degrees of quality within that, and I think that, you know, those two names in my mind really stand out. So that's kind of a tangent. I was really just explaining.
No, it's good to get more insight into that space as well.
Yeah, just because it's like, I don't know, it's pretty hard to find or like get really a lot of insight there. Yeah, going on the rest of the day, we normally do like an hour meeting on Tuesdays where we talk about I'm trying to think of how to best abstract this. So anytime you're buying ads for any intent, like every impression that you buy is an opportunity to learn what message converts the best. So anytime you're buying ads, you know, the impressions you're buying, opportunity to learn, I think it's super important to maximize that opportunity. And so we've got a process that kind of helps do that, or supports doing that. And really central to that is obviously the creatives who are, you know, producing the ads, and then the growth marketers who are buying the space, optimizing, thinking about the campaigns, thinking about the targeting strategies, and keeping an open dialogue and talking about the results and saying like, okay, well, if this is working, why is it working? You know, how do we turn what's working up to a 10 and what's not working down to a 0? And so we spend, you know, so we have dedicated time every week for that. And then, you know, like the rest of the time, eating lunch, there's some time just kind of staring at the point where the corner meets the ceiling, like up, just sort of in a, you know, kind of trying to catch my breath. But otherwise, it's just either meeting other people in the studio, you know, talking with the data teams about preparing for our worldwide launch, things like that. So just like pipeline stuff. And then thinking about what our Q4 looks like was the rest of my time.
Okay, and what do you have slotted to do after
this?
Yeah.
So after this, I'm actually talking to Sony, so I'll get on the phone with them and we'll talk about how the games are going, you know, what new exciting stuff we can do. There's a tournament at Champions coming up for Jeopardy, so there's opportunities, you know, to do stuff with them. So that's super exciting. And then past that, more onboarding stuff for the team, and just sort of a lot of teaching and mentoring. Yeah, so every day I will normally spend like an hour or so just grabbing coffee with team members and spending time and talking about, you know, what's going well, what could go better, what they think they could do better, and really sort of like, I'm a big fan of tight feedback loops, so like how to manage that, and so we kind of have a process for that. So that's like always a big afternoon focus. I think that's the best time to have those discussions.
Nice. And you alluded to this about a few times about how the competitive strategy for marketing is very important, but also there's the strategy of just the company's, I guess, products in its own in terms of the whole gaming space. And so if I kind of separated that into two different buckets, and we kind of first tackled on the competitive spaces in the gaming world, I think with my kind of more level of understanding, the way that most mobile gaming companies that tend to make money, you kind of have these small number of whales that tend to feed a lot of the revenue, whereas let's say like 90% are just kind of free users who create this good ecosystem. And is that the kind of environment that you operate in as well, competing with like these kind of people, or would you say that your competitive environment's different with your kind of games?
No, I think that like a lot of the spaces like that, maybe it's maybe diversifying a bit now. I think that over the last year you've seen some changes. I think you're starting to see more games. There's like a couple studios over the last year that have been really successful at it, but doing ad-based stuff, or more ad-based. So depending on the type, so you have IAP revenue and ad purchases. So what you're kind of talking about traditional free-to-play, where you have the distribution is more concentrated on a few larger spenders and then maybe some smaller spenders, but it's like sort of a long tail effect where most of the population is not spending. So like a Pareto or a Lomax distribution, and then you have, and then the other strategy for monetizing that other percentage is through ads. So, and I think the way you do that is really important. So creating an experience that's not crappy. So like I think a huge thing is like how you provide value, how you do stuff that always feels like content, always provides value, always like delights the user. I think that's like a huge important thing, because that way you ensure high retention, you ensure that people stick around for a long time. But yeah, I think that's sort of very much the space that a lot of people are in. We're probably more of an IAP studio than I would say we are an ad studio. So for reference, if you've ever played or downloaded games from like the top charts that are maybe more simple, there's like a ball bouncing or like balls.io or some pretty sort of similar stuff to publishers that come to mind. They both develop and they publish, but more on the latter would be Ketchup or Voodoo. So those are two names of companies that have become pretty successful at making sort of smaller games. Like if you think about the depth of the game, it's smaller. And where the main monetization or main mechanic is ad monetization, because everyone's always trying to grow their game, so that's always a great source of revenue. Obviously, there's a trade-off between, is it better to show an ad to somebody, especially if they could potentially spend money in your app, but if your primary focus is in showing those ads, then it becomes a slightly simpler equation. And then your main goal is just to come up with something that's fun, compelling, and that's fairly low cost to produce. And then being able to do that and replicate that strategy frequently, and then being able to generate high install volumes while ensuring reasonable retention over a period of time. So that's so maybe the Voodoo, and then nothing of that is unique. Like everyone obviously wants high retention, high volume, but I think there's a specific emphasis on the game design where you have things that are a lot more simple, a lot more accessible. The term hyper casual. Well, it's kind of done to death. Everyone's like, oh, hyper casual, what makes it successful? And it's like, oh, it's got to be a ball game or something like sort of really basic. I think that's kind of overdone, at least if you read like a lot of the content marketing or the industry stuff lately. But that's kind of the space that would be the opposite to say maybe IAP. Just to kind of give you a brief or a high-level overview of that.
Right. And what's the IEP acronym?
In-app purchases.
In-app purchases.
Yeah. So that's like I said, a lot of acronyms in this space. Yeah. So IAP, in-app purchases, and so that's that would be the more sort of traditional model where you have games like your hardcore, midcore that are very in-app focused. Whether it's like strategy games, like that's obviously very IAP heavy.
Right.
Or social casino, which is another super heavy category, and that's a really big category as well. Yeah, so those are sort of maybe on the one end of the spectrum, and on the other you have studios, titles, games that are much more casual.
Okay. And I think there's kind of the mantra in a lot of the startup companies where just build a great product and people will come. And there's the other side that goes, no, you got to market everything, and even if it's not as great of a product, people will still come. Like how do you guys balance the marketing effort and the product side to first acquire and then retain? Like, does it change how much you focus on each other depending on the phase?
Yeah. So I think that no matter how good your UA is, no matter how good your marketing is, if the game isn't a good, so when I quantify as good game, what I mean, when it doesn't balance its economy with the fun that users have playing it, like if it's not like a well-designed title, no amount of like the most successful acquisition will never back out because you're competing with people for the average cost of inventory. So just really just the idea is your game has to be able to generate the same amount of value, or on average the same amount of value as other titles relative to the average cost of inventory. So everything's based on a CPM pricing, more or less. So per 1,000 impressions. So that's typically how the ad space is bought. And unless your title is able to do that, you won't be able to compete. And so like, even if you have these crazy sophisticated marketing, if the product isn't there, which is kind of like the heart of it, if the product's not there, then you're just not going to be successful. I don't think. Maybe if there's like, if I would actually love to find an example of like a crappy product and great marketing. Well, actually there are examples of that, but I think not like at the extreme.
Right.
And so that's why I think like product is always really important. I think that when growth and when acquisition informs product, and you look at companies that do that really well, where people have where it's clear that they've obviously thought a lot about not just building a really great product, but like building a really great product that's really easy to bring other people into. I think a great example of that is always when you see people that have really great user onboarding, so like really great tutorials. They're called FTEs in this space, so first time user experience. So when you have a really strong first time user experience, I think that really lends itself to having higher early term retention, which translates to more people playing the game later, more people potentially monetizing, more people around for it's more people, better products. So like that attention to the player experience, I think is super important. And then so like product, so it's always product first, really, to simplify. But in the ways you do that, there's tons of different ways. But it's like, how do you make a great product that's fun to play, and that people want to continue to play? And I think that's, it's really easy to say, but obviously that's the art, and that's the business and the competitive advantage is, having insight into that and being able to do that, and make games that people want to play for years, not just like, download it, play it, and then delete it.
Yeah, I think that whole habit forming mentality of like, okay, how am I going to get someone really addicted, and in a positive way to this game, make it into a habit, is definitely the art form. So for you then, how do you create, like what kind of habits do you have to make yourself effective throughout the day? And do you use the same techniques that you guys implement in designing games for yourself as well?
Oh, for sure. I'm a huge fan of like habit formation and like trying to design habits. I spend a lot, like I said, that Tuesday morning, Tuesday morning thing. That's huge. That's the Tuesday morning thing is huge for me. But main habits that I always try. Let's see, I've got a ton of them. I'm trying to figure out what ones are good to share and what ones make sense. I find like the cadence at which I plan, so I've really tried to build habits around really specific near-term planning. So building space in the day to plan to be reactive. So like at 4 o'clock every day, I'm normally in the office till like 6 or 7, but at 4 o'clock, I kind of like stop early, spend 30 minutes planning my next day. I'm a huge user, like more on the power user end of Google Calendar. So like my entire, I have my calendar like open, so like people can, like all my team can see like exactly what I'm doing all day. And it's like blocked, like even my like 10-minute breaks will blocked off. It's like stare at the ceiling for 10 minutes, be blocked off. Maybe not that extreme, but like that's like the level of focus that I have. So I'm really interested in that. A lot of my habits, I think, center around like data collection. So like how to be really effective with like the data that you produce. So I'm a huge fan of oh god, now I'm gonna forget the name. I think it's Eisenhower's decision matrix.
General Eisenhower.
Yeah. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is like important, urgent, not important, not urgent, or that's.
Oh, the Stephen Covey talks about that too. Yeah.
It's like
the not important, the not urgent and important is like the top.
Yeah,
you want to do.
Yeah. So you have that like decision matrix of like how, and I'm getting really reflexive about like when you have to do something. Like I like have a little like 4-quadrant thing, the way that I write stuff down, and just trying to get like the most out of my time. and using that to do it. So it's like, okay, so as soon as you have something that you know is important but not urgent, well, you just always schedule that, and that just goes in the calendar, and you just don't. And like, I guess really practicing how to context switch, going from like, okay, like being really focused on something, and then being like, oh, whatever, I'm gonna go focus on this thing, and being really good at like leaving whatever you were doing, just packing it up in your head and just like putting it on the shelf for later, which has always eluded me sort of. So that's sort of something I focus on.
And it's also very different to multitasking too. It's actually closing something and focusing on one thing, prioritizing that, so that your mind's actually focused on one thing instead of being on two screens and doing two different things. It's really...
Yeah, I think I'm a huge fan of it's somebody like it's a famous like Google thing where they talk about like really processing and doing things in serial as opposed to parallel. So like tasks in serial, I'm a huge fan of. So I really try to say like, okay, here's this one thing, and focusing on priorities and not just doing a ton of things, but doing like one thing really well, and then moving on to the next thing. I think there's some anecdote about at Google early on, they had this system where someone could like walk up to you and say a specific keyword. I don't know what it was. It was like rabbit or something, and they say rabbit, and you had to pull like this one thing that you were working on that was really effective. So the idea of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, and anyone could walk up to you and say that, and you had to say like the most important thing that you were working on. So that's I guess kind of like the idea of really attacking things in serial as opposed to parallel. And I think like multitasking and like parallel approaches are always like really like, oh, that's how you should work, but being like really focused and serial about things I think is important.
Yeah,
and
I think it's the effective and efficient battle. You want to be effective rather than being efficient.
Exactly, that trade-off. And I think probably the last thing is 5-minute journaling.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you use the 5-minute journal, the book itself, or
not? So don't need to buy the book, but the idea of so like for me, I always ask like, okay, like practicing gratitude I think is super important. So like 3 things to be grateful for, 3 things that will make the day a success, and then at the end of the day, 3 amazing things that happened in the day, and then like what could go better. Do that every day. Write that down. And I've found like that's had a really profound effect on the way that I think about stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've mentioned it a couple of times in my own blog post too. Like I think I've had a journaling habit for about 3 years now, so it's been constantly evolving. So I started with the book, the 5-minute journal.
Okay.
And then I found that it was too limiting for what I wanted to do, so I got a bigger notebook so I could actually write everything down. Okay. And then that's constantly evolved to like an Evernote now, where I keep everything on like a daily Evernote thing, and I have templates for beginning day and then end of day.
Yes.
And now I review it. So I reviewed it yesterday. So every Monday I review the week's worth of journals, so I can re-go through everything kind of, and then disseminate the data into different piles of my life. That's all on Evernote.
Yeah, that's smart. I'm still working on building in my like because I think like you need to write it down, and then you also need to like consume it, and like you're like, okay, like I think that one of my favorite ways of doing that, which came from a friend who's really good at asking questions, was just asking like, okay, well, like what was the best part of your week last week? And I think like just that like super simple question, and like if you look at your journals to kind of like try to understand that, because it's hard to pull out just like pull that out of a hat, but asking that question of what was the best part of your week, I think is super telling in terms of improving your happiness, improving how effective you are at whatever it is you're doing. If you can figure out what it is that you like, and then try to like increase that, and then always try to like split what you like and what you don't.
Yeah. And so right now, if someone were to come to you and ask, hey Conrad, I want to form a habit, and if you were to guide them through how to make something into a habit, using a similar framework you do for game design, how would that framework look like?
Positive reinforcement, frequently. So like strong positive feedback.
How frequently?
As frequently as possible, to not be noise. So I think it really depends on like what the habit is that you're trying to reinforce. I think that's, like if you get into, so this is more talking about game design, but if you try to do something too frequently, it doesn't necessarily work. That's why if you look at maybe some strategy games or some different categories, you'll see they design it in a way where it's efficient for you to not play. So they don't want you to burn out. Yeah, so some games that have like timers or different things that involve like waiting for resources to collect, that's all been designed so that you take a break.
Oh, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. So what that designer is wanting you to do is to play, to really enjoy it, and then you want to stop. And then they want to create a reason for it to be really effective for you to come back.
Right, like I'm now looking forward to playing that when the time is up. Oh,
exactly.
Honestly, when I was playing, so I don't play games often, but I was for a period of time really into Clash of Clans, like many people were.
Yeah, the king. And, they're the king of that.
Yeah, and I always thought, oh, they're trying to make me pay money. I'm not gonna fall for that. I'll just wait.
Yeah, no. They just want you to. But eventually, I'm sure that at some point you paid money, but really beyond what they're trying to do, other than just encouraging, because that's one of the ways is that you trade time for money. Like that's like a really clear balance in those types of games, which is like there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's the they do I think a pretty good job of it for the most part, but the other thing that's happening that's under the hood of all that you don't really notice is you're getting more not addicted, but like you're enjoying it more because there's an efficiency trade-off, right? It's clear, and this was done even better in Clash Royale, where there was an efficiency for not playing. You could play as much as you wanted. The whole chess mechanics, I don't know if you played, but different to Clash of Clans. For Clash Royale, they just had a system where you could play endlessly, but you stopped getting rewards after a certain point. So that made it like, oh well, I'll just play this much and then wait and play later. And so that's the kind of the way of creating a habit where it's sort of really smart about when you want that frequency, but always having tight feedback. So like you do the habit, you get a reward. There's a model for building habits called the hooked model.
By EL?
Yeah, I can't pronounce it. I was going to say I can't pronounce his name to save my life, but yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I think his book is called Hooked. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a spectacular book.
Yeah.
That book's great. That model. So you need like a hook, you need a tight reward, and then you need something that's going to remind somebody. So like, you have like an external stimuli that says, oh, I should do this. You do it, and then you feel good because you've done it, and something positive happens. That's how you build a habit. So whether that's like, you want to always, let's say you want to try to, what's the most basic something that people want to do? Okay, lose weight, for example. So like one way that I might think about that is like, okay, so in order to do that, you need to be conscious of your weight. The best way to do that is to have a scale. You take that a step further, get a smart scale. So then you have a smart scale. If you weigh yourself every day and you collect that data automatically, like put, what's it called? Like Fitbit. So there's like a simple if this then that like recipe to put your smart scale weight into a spreadsheet. So all of a sudden you have this habit where you step on the scale, you see a number. If that number is lower or it's good, then you feel good about that, and you're further rewarded because it's now in a spreadsheet, and you're further incentivized to keep working towards your goals. If you step on the scale and you see a number you don't like, well, that's also reinforcement to do something about it, and you have that stored so that you can reflect back on it later. And in either way, as long as you do that every day, you collect that data. And also, if you don't do that, you don't end up with the data, and then that's a negative. You're like, oh well, I missed out. So having that is sort of a positive and negative for the habit, I think, is also like having feedback either way. I think is important.
No, I think I totally agree with you. I think that whole data keeping mindset of actually recording everything so you can actually look at it as proof it's honestly a game changer. I think like the recent habit I worked on the latest was taking a photo of everything I eat and putting it up on Instagram. And the idea was just so I can actually keep track of just what I eat, and I have a very big addiction to pastries, and so it's an idea to change my consumer behavior around that. And I have noticed that once I started posting every meal I take on Instagram, I stopped eating like sugary almond croissants, and
really?
I transitioned over to just plain croissants, which is much less in calories and much less in sugar, and so it's helping me with my diet so that I can lower my weight, so I don't have to do as big of a cut when I go compete in my powerlifting competitions.
Okay.
And yeah, I think it's been a good reinforcing habit where you just constantly post it up, and sometimes you might get a nice friend who says, great job, like I'm noticing that there's some improvement, and then so there's that kind of feedback loop that hits you. Or my coach message me and say, hey Dan, see what you're doing there. And so that kind of stuff I think definitely does help. But keeping that data and like actually looking back and then seeing what did I actually eat for like the past month is a good indicator of actually helping form more habits that actually stay with you.
I think that's huge.
And so we're kind of I guess wrapping up on to the later ending parts of the interview. And so for someone who is thinking of going into a growth role, like a growth marketing role, what kind of qualities do you think would make a person be a good fit for a growth marketing role? Like if they were to, like the strengths that the person should have to really succeed in this kind of role?
Sure. So I spent a lot of time on this because I've been hiring.
It's perfect.
So this is like, I've like been doing this to death. So I think that in order to be really successful in this role, regardless of where it is, whether it's here or anywhere, intellectual curiosity is huge. Like if you do not have intellectual curiosity, you're like in trouble. Hopefully you still have a pulse. I don't know. I just like can't get my head around. You can't be like, oh wow, like there's just the access. And this leads me to the second point, but I kid you not, just the ability to Google. So like just being able to figure stuff out. So, whatever it is, obviously you should always be provided with a lot of support when you're learning a new role or when you're trying to accomplish something, but just Google, like it's amazing what you can Google just trying to figure out how to solve a problem. And really developing like a great Google sense. I actually I try to engineer stuff. It's really hard to test for, but to try and figure out like, okay, well, how good is this person? And I guess what I'm saying is really just problem solving. Like, how good are you at solving problems? Obviously, Google's a great tool for that. So intellectual curiosity, ability to Google / problem solve, and then being super data driven. I think that in most growth roles in a lot of places, there's always going to be a lot of access to data. And so how you take advantage of that. And then I think there's also, depending on how top of funnel the growth role is, really always having like a strong, whether you call it a business sense or really just understanding like how value is created. I will sort of call it, my shorthand for it is just like having a truffle sense, like they're either dogs or pigs that are trained to smell truffles in a forest. Like that's how truffles are farmed. And so my analogy to that is just like, when you hear an opportunity, or whether it's, for buying media or whether it's a feature or whether it's something, like, can you smell the leverage? And you're like, oh, that's great. Like that's, that's going to be either really profitable or that's going to be really successful. Like, do you get that? Can you sense that? And then does it excite you? So that's the last thing is like, do you have a spark? Like, is there like, if when I'm talking to you, and I hadn't really quite found a way to do this super successfully without talking to somebody, but when you talk to somebody, if they get like visibly excited about stuff, not to say that, quiet introverted people aren't successful in growth, because I think that's, some of the, like one of our co-founders is like quite quiet. So like, I do mean excitement, like on a relative personal scale, but when somebody gets excited and you can see that excitement, that's something that I think is really important in growth, because it's really easy to get burnt out. There's a ton of stuff. Like, it's a really difficult space because by virtue of what you're doing, you're always trying to grow. So there's always like, oh, like, have you hit your goal? It's like, yeah, but like, the goal is going to be more. The goal is always more, which is sort of can be difficult. So, managing that, and I think that kind of personality trait is really helpful.
Yeah. And so now, doing a bit of an exercise with you, if, let's say we forecast out 10 years, it's now 2028, September 18th, and, let's say you're taken care of financially, all your financial goals and all that's met, what do you want to be doing?
Still problem solving. Like, don't even need to hesitate. Like, still solving problems. Like, doesn't matter. I'm a huge problem solving addict. Like, all else being equal, probably working with like early stage So like not scale. So like, you can break this out as to say, okay, startups, scale ups. I don't necessarily know like what the EBITDA or what the revenue numbers that differentiates them, but helping like working more like on the startup side, doing helping people scale. This is probably like then the kind of problems that go around with that. Because I think that ties into like really for me, it's like I just like solving problems. Like that's really exciting. So in 10 years, it's probably like I'm probably in a scenario where I have hopefully been successful at solving enough problems that I'm in a position where I can sort of pick and choose what problems I want to solve. And then set myself up in an environment that I can sort of just tee them up and try and solve them like as rapidly as possible is probably what I would want to do, I think.
Kind of like a growth mercenary.
Yeah, like I think there's like opportunity. You see people who work with, say like obviously like VC funds are always investing in a lot of places, and like when any time a startup gets a ton of money, they need help how to deploy that. So like that's a potential area, like that's super interesting. It's like, oh, okay, is there an opportunity there? Is there who really is just like who's having problems, or not even having problems, but like who's trying to find more problems to solve in order to grow and scale and that kind of stuff. So that's the stuff that really interests me.
Nice. And so we did the forecasting bit. If we were to look back and if you could go look at your 20-year-old self, 20-year-old Conrad in, I guess still in school probably.
Yeah.
And if he could look at where you are now doing what you are doing, what do you think his emotional reaction would be? Would it be surprise or more expected?
I don't know if it'd be like, I don't want to say like, I don't want to say, I wouldn't be surprised, because that sounds super egotistical. I think there's always, I didn't necessarily know, like I kind of I'm not necessarily huge on like prescriptive paths, but maybe more like cones of direction, where I'm sort of like gesturing my arms sort of like out wide, kind of in a triangle. But that's the kind of way I think it's like, okay, you're maybe not necessarily going to do exactly this, because I don't think anything really ever goes like super according to plan. But being like, okay, being able to sort of like forecast, like, okay, I'm going to head in this general, 25 to 45 degree direction. And I kind of had that's kind of always been the way that I've really approached things, from like really early. So that's kind of the way that I approach things. So I'd probably the emotional reaction would be like, oh, that's good. I kind of would be like surprised and like, oh, okay, so it worked. It's sort of like healthy skepticism, we call it, maybe.
Yeah. And if you could give advice to that 20-year-old Conrad, what kind of advice would you like to give him? Kind of the advice that you wish you had gotten at 20.
Okay. The advice that I wish I had gotten at 20, maybe is too specific to me, but I think that there's like, it's all going to be like anything is just going to be a ton of hard work. So you need a lot of grit. Not to say that I didn't have it when I was younger. But I think that there's some things, or there's a tendency for some people to think that like, oh, okay, so like it's always going to be, regardless of what you want to like achieve, unless you just set your targets just really low, and then it's easy to achieve that. But like any good stretch goal is like really difficult. I would probably say like, look, sort of disregard a lot and just get really good at working really hard. And then get really in tune with what makes you happy, and then just work really hard for what makes you happy, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. Like I made some unconventional, like I left business school effectively, and had wound up back sort of in business, or a lot of the similar profile would probably be like a business school grad for my position at any other studio. So I think the advice would probably be like, just get really good at working really hard early. I think I probably had maybe like a year or two of slacking. I don't know if much would have changed, but yeah, like get really good at working hard.
Yeah, and this might be related to what you just said, but is there a belief that you have that you think goes against conventional wisdom in a business or career standpoint?
The classic question, like, what do you believe that everybody else doesn't?
Or you think everyone else does?
What I think everyone else does. Yeah. Yeah, maybe around prescriptives of success. Like I think that there's a lot of conventional wisdom about how to hire, and I'm not super sold on a lot of that.
Okay.
So like my beliefs lead to I end up having to spend a ton more time hiring, because I'm not, like I don't really care where somebody went to school. A lot of the things that I think as like predictors of success are maybe more like traditional predictors of success, like, where you went to school, some things like that. I've also been proven wrong on this. But I think that it's like a lot of it is like, the types of traits of the individual, like the way they operate. I care less about like resume and buzzwords, things like that. I don't know, maybe that's not traditional wisdom or not. I'm not quite sure. That would probably be one of them, or at least the easiest one for me to share offhand, is my like lack of trust in like that traditional school of thought. Yeah, I'm going to say that's it for now, but I'll tell you if I think of anything else.
All right. No, that's good.
Cool.
Great. Oh, thanks for coming on the podcast, and I really think our audience will get like a great idea of what people in growth do and find your story fascinating. So thank you so much for coming.
Awesome, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please check out other episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date for the future episodes. Also, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, whichever is applicable to you. To see past episodes, you can go to oldmandan.com/podcasts. Also, you can sign up to my weekly newsletter on my blog, oldmandan.com/newsletter. You can stay up to date with future podcast episodes that way, and included in the newsletter are my book reviews I write, my weekly article related to the domain of self-development systems, as well as 7 things I learned throughout the week on being healthy, wealthy, and wise. Finally, special thanks to icons8.com for allowing me to use their music Tiny People on the podcast. Great. I will see you all next time. Take care.